Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. Welcome to Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction's official podcast. I'm Razia Iqbal, journalist, broadcaster and your host for today. On March the 9th, the shortlist for the Winner of Winners Award, which will go to the best of the previous 24 winners of the Baillie Gifford Prize, was announced. The shortlist was chosen by a panel of judges chaired by Jason Cowley and featuring Sarah Churchwell, Shahida Bari and Francis Wilson. Here to tell us more about the shortlisted books are Jason Cowley and Sarah Churchwell. Jason is the editor-in-chief of the New Statesman magazine, and Sarah is Professor in American Literature and Chair of Public Understanding of the Humanities at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. Welcome to you both. I'm delighted to be able to speak about these books with you. So, Jason, let's start with you. Tell us what the 6 books are that you have chosen.
There were 24 winners and we have 6 on our shortlist. Craig Brown, 1, 2, 3, 4, The Beatles in Time. Wade Davis, Into the Silence, The Great War, Mallory and the Conquest of Everest. Barbara Demick, Nothing to Envy, Real Lives in North Korea. Patrick Radden Keith, Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty. Margaret Macmillan, Paris 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World. And James Shapiro, 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare.
Quite an extraordinary feat to have to choose 6 books out of 24 that have already impressed 24 sets of judges. I mean, how did you even embark on that? I mean, what was the framework that you went into this judging process with?
Well, we had no set framework. We could only work with what we were given, which were the 24 winners. They're all good books. They're all prize-winning books. And my colleagues, the other judges, approached the task in different ways. But we were looking for books of outstanding literary quality, books that showed some kind of literary intelligence, books that were doing something with form, were innovative in some ways. We were interested in, of course, the quality of the language, how a writer told the story, how the writer had embarked upon the project, the depth of research, the rigour, the diligence. And it was an extraordinary process, but a very pleasurable one, because there were books that I'd read previously, which I read again. There were books on the list that I never thought I'd read, which when I began them, I enjoyed reading them. Books of history, biography, memoir, investigative journalism. So there was great variety. And I think we all read the books in different ways and in different order. I don't know about what Sarah would have to say on that.
Yeah, I wonder, Sarah, you and I were both judges in 2017 on this prize. I mean, how different was this process compared to judging a whole set of new books that had not won, not this prize anyway, but had not won anything?
It was different, and it was more different than I had anticipated, if I'm honest, because it added both a layer of pleasure and a real layer of difficulty in that, as Jason says, I mean, these books are all, by definition, excellent. I mean, they all went through a really rigorous process of the type that you and I went through, in the first time around. And so what makes it really pleasurable is that there just aren't any duds, right? You're not reading any books where you think, oh, why did that one get put forward? They're all excellent, and you can see why the judges chose them in their year. And that, of course, is the challenge then, is that you've got 24 books that are all excellent on their merits, and trying to, in a reasonably fair and consistent way, sift through different kinds of excellence is actually really difficult, where you're weighing off, as Jason said, different kinds of styles, different approaches, different questions, so that they're not trying to do the same thing, and you want to judge them on what they were trying to do and how well they did it, and then judge them against each other. And so it is really, really challenging, but definitely an enjoyable and incredibly educational process.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. I mean, obviously, the hardest of all the decisions that you have made to date will be choosing a winner out of those 6. Let's start with the first that you mentioned on the list, Jason, Craig Brown, which is, you would think that there is really nothing more interesting to say, or new, perhaps new is the right word, about the Beatles, and yet he manages to do this extraordinary thing of making it not just entertaining and brilliantly written and funny, but he tells us really wonderful stories about the Beatles and the people who have loved them.
He does. I, for one, didn't think I ever wanted to read another book about the Beatles, or indeed a long article about the Beatles. I grew up in a household as a young boy in the 1970s. My father was a Beatles fan, so the Beatles music was playing all the time, and inevitably one kind of turns away sometimes from one's parents' musical choices, and I embraced other forms of music. And, I was not a product of the late 60s, although I was born in the late 60s. That wasn't my time, as it were. And I'm not as interested in the Beatles as clearly Craig Brown is, who's older than me and absolutely adores them. And in many ways, Craig's book is a fan's biography, but it's so much more than that. And what I like so much about it is it's an experiment in form, and he subverts the form of the biography in strange and innovative and witty ways. And, he tells the story of the Beatles through vignettes, little news snippets, strange mini biographies. He explores social class. He explores the politics of the 1960s. So it's as much a book about the social atmosphere of England at that time as it is a book about those 4 guys that we know who became the Beatles. It's also a book about chance. And Craig Brown is a very sophisticated and witty writer. And there's great sophistication and wit in the writing and in the prose. And it's a very enjoyable read as well. I mean, I think you could share this book with anyone interested in good writing, and they would enjoy it. It has a dark undercurrent, of course, because the story of the Beatles is in some ways a journey from light towards a kind of darkness. And there's obviously the suicide of Brian Epstein right at the centre of the book, which actually Brown writes about in different ways throughout. And another important feature of the book is it's actually an experiment in time as well. He moves back and forward in time. He subverts, he repeats, he returns. And it's a book that really did surprise me.
Let's turn to Patrick Radden Keefe's Empire of Pain, which is the most recent winner on the list. This is a book that originated from a very long piece in the New Yorker. Radden Keefe is a staff writer on the New Yorker magazine, and it addresses the origins of the opioid crisis and not just the effects of it and how it continues to reverberate, but the Sackler family at the heart of the drug that has created the opioid crisis. We think we know an awful lot about the opioid crisis, Sarah, but what about this book made you think it has to be in this list?
Well, it's just that. It's that I went into it thinking I know an awful lot about this, and thinking that I was going to know broadly what happened in it and the story that he was going to tell, and I absolutely didn't. And it's an extraordinary feat of investigative reporting, and it's also it's a social and cultural history of America in the second half of the 20th century, told from a really different viewpoint, not really a story of addiction as such, but a story about consumer culture, a story about monopoly capitalism, really, about, the kind of second coming of the robber barons. This is, you could be reading about Gilded Age monopoly financiers of the late 19th century at some points in the story. And it's just a gripping read. So there's this way in which everything is at stake. It's telling you all kinds of things you didn't know. There's a really, really interesting dynastic family biography at the heart of it. It's also a story about what wealth does to people about second-generation wealth. And with all of those stories that may or may not have some levels of familiarity, Radden Keefe keeps finding new things to say about that and keeps the story gripping and surprising. And by the end of it, I went into it not liking the Sacklers, and I came out of it loathing them to a degree that I think is a really important part of what the book wants to do, because it is also a not to sound too pious, but it's a moral exploration of, the uses and misuses of power, and the fact that that Sackler's legacy continues around the world is something that Radden Keefe really delves into in the book. And so this is not a story that's over. It's not a story where the consequences are finished and we can consign it to the dustbins of history. This is living all around us, and it entails us making choices after we finish reading this book.
Jason, as a journalist yourself, I felt that this is a really important book. Couldn't be more different to Craig Brown's.
Yeah, absolutely. Radden Keefe is a master of the long form narrative report, classically American magazine style journalism. But he's much more than that. He can also write extraordinary books, as he has before, Northern Ireland and the Troubles. And Sarah's right, this book has great kind of moral power, it has great political power, but it's also a feat of storytelling. It's an astonishingly compulsive book. It's very long, but it doesn't feel long when you're reading it, because you're utterly gripped by the power of the storytelling and the way he crafts and shapes the story. And it is also the story of this great family, the Sacklers, and it begins by telling the story of the three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer and Raymond, and how they rose, combining medicine, advertising, pharmaceuticals, painkillers to acquire the power and the wealth that they did. And above all else, the Sacklers were interested in burnishing their name. The father of the three brothers said to them, what matters most of all is to have a good name. And they used their power and the wealth to sponsor art galleries, and philanthropy aggressively was used to promote their name, to burnish their name, to smooth their access into high society. And Patrick Radden Keefe absolutely demolishes the family name. He shatters it, he destroys it. The book is an indictment of a particular kind of capitalism, and has awesome power, I think.
It really is quite an achievement. Let's stay with a book written by another journalist, Barbara Demick, American foreign correspondent for the Los Angeles Times for a very long time. Her book, Nothing to Envy, is quite different to Radden Keefe's, given that they both come from journalists who are interested in the long form of narrative nonfiction. This is about a country that none of us really know a great deal about, and Barbara manages, from speaking to 100 people who have all defected from the same place, and the stories she tells about their lives really helps us understand something about North Korea that we didn't know before. Sarah, what did you make of Barbara's book?
Well, it doesn't just tell me something I didn't know about North Korea before. It tells me everything I didn't know about North Korea before, because, of course, it is one of the countries that is most shrouded in secrecy, and so her approach is really clever, in my view. She interviews people who've escaped from North Korea and are now living in South Korea, and she chooses people who've all come from the same small city near the northern border with China, and she chooses it deliberately, she explains, because she doesn't want to talk to people from Pyongyang, which is, arguably the most Western of North Korea's cities, the one that is, available to tourists, at least under very, very controlled circumstances. But she wanted to talk to people who come from the remote parts of North Korea that the Western world and Western journalists simply do not see and do not talk to, and to understand their stories about what it was like to live in North Korea, particularly during the famine. This is really a book about famine and its effects on families. And each of them has a different relationship to to the North Korean regime. She's very careful to select people from a range of political approaches. So these are by no means all people who you would have expected from childhood to need to leave North Korea. Many of them, grew up believing that they lived in the most wonderful country in the world, and eventually ended up in South Korea. And she wanted to understand how that happened and to tell these stories, on a really, really human level. And it's another really gripping read in a way that I didn't expect, because what happens is the suspense builds about why each of these individuals or sometimes families are going to choose to leave, and then how are they going to get out? So it becomes a great escape story. What's going to happen to them? Will they make it? What is going to be their route? And what kind of future awaits them? And it's really an extraordinary book, and changed all kinds of preconceptions what preconceptions I had about North Korea. She overturned all of them.
Jason, what about you? I mean, the kind of the human stories at the heart of this, against the backdrop of the big geopolitics that we think we know a little bit about in terms of North Korea. Was that the thing that moved you?
Yeah, she actually, you're right that she spoke to a lot of people, 100 people, but actually it's a book about 6 people who she focuses in on and tells their stories. 6, ordinary Koreans, one of whom is a true believer, believes absolutely in the Kim dictatorship. But if you look at the book, it's set in the northeast of the country, quite close to the Chinese border. Shongjian is the town, a former fishing village, which was the site of a Japanese steel mill and is known as the City of Iron. So it's an industrial town, particularly badly affected during the famine of the 1990s. And Sarah's right, it is a book about the effects of that devastating famine. But what Demick does so well is it sort of takes you into the country and gives you a great sense of what Hilary Mantel calls the atmospheric pressure of events, and what it's like to live inside that regime when you can trust nobody. You can't even trust your husband or wife or your children or your close family. And it's a surveillance culture, and it's a culture of terror and of fear and of brutality and of repression. And she captures all of this very well indeed.
The next 3 books are definitely door stoppers, really, but also dealing with vast, just the scope of them is quite extraordinary. Sarah, let's talk about Margaret Macmillan's Peacemakers, a huge book about the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, 6 weeks that changed the world. It's seen as a really interesting revisionist piece of history writing. What was it that she did that earned her a place on this shortlist?
I think Paris 1919 is a really extraordinary book, and I loved reading it for all kinds of reasons, not least because it's a period that I've spent a lot of time researching and reading about myself, usually from a more Americanist perspective. And it is, first of all, it's an extraordinary feat of, Jason was talking about control, of controlling an enormous amount of research and information. It's really a story. It's a story of global history in one pivotal year, and it is. The best way I think to describe what she does in it is actually using what was one of the titles that the book had in a previous edition. It was also called The Peacemakers. And that's a scorchingly ironic title, actually, because Macmillan's story is really about how the leaders of, the so-called Great Four, the great leaders after the First World War, came together with absolutely the best of intentions. They wanted to make peace, but what they did was unravel peace. And she shows how the Treaty of Versailles and the post-war settlement was actually the grounds for so much unfolding conflict and the spiraling dissolution of order that came out of the judgments and the misjudgments and the human error. And you could almost call it a human comedy if the consequences weren't so tragic. But it does have great moments of comedy. She's a very witty narrator. She is not a particularly self-effacing narrator. And for me, that's a very important part of reading this book, because there's a vast cast of characters. There all kinds of shifting geopolitical boundaries. It's about shifting geopolitical boundaries. And so you need that sense of somebody with a steady hand at the tiller who's helping you navigate these turbulent seas. And she's witty and she's wise, and you know that you're in fairly safe hands. And for me, what's most important about this book is that although it sounds like it's about Europe, what she does is, as she moves through the story that she's telling, the boundaries keep shifting. It's like concentric circles widening out further and further as you realize that the ripple effect of these decisions are unsettling countries all around the world. And she holds off on the nations that are arguably, most consequential for the late 20th and early 21st century, and thinking about how the Treaty of Versailles affected Asia and the Middle East. And so part of the revisionist project here is to say that this is not just about the catastrophic handling of Germany's post-war settlement, but about what happens to all of the other nations that were caught up in the consequences of this conflict.
Jason, for you, how important was it that she kind of holds the hand of the reader in a way that makes this subject, this vast subject, so accessible?
Yeah, holding the hand, I don't think is quite the right phrase, actually. It suggests a certain kind of teacherly aspect or didactic aspect. And I don't find that in the book at all. What I admire greatly about it is its subversive point of view. The Razia side. She's a very witty writer, I think, particularly when grappling with such a grave subject as the First World War, its consequences, and then the effects of the Versailles Peace project. She's brilliant at character sketches, really good at choosing the right quotation to capture someone. This is Lloyd George, for example, on Balfour. And this is how he might be remembered by history. He will be just like a scent on a pocket handkerchief. In other words,
that's brilliant.
Just utterly transient. And she's very good at that. And there's many of them. And I could go on for a long time quoting from the book. She has great political understanding, great grasp of the sweep of history.
Well, let's turn to another book with huge scope and also a very long book, Wade Davis, the Canadian anthropologist, Into the Silence, the Great War, Mallory and the Conquest of Everest. Jason, let's stay with you. What was it about this book that made you think, yep, this is one that I want far more people to read now than when it first came out?
Yeah, I remember when he won the prize, actually, I was at the dinner and he gave a very gracious speech, I thought. And therefore I got hold of the book, actually, at the time. But because of its immense size, I never got round to reading it. I found it looked intimidating. And also, although I'm a big sports fan, I'm not that interested in mountaineering. And I was never that interested in the whole epic quest to reach the summit of Everest, which is the story of the book, actually. So it wasn't a book I thought I would naturally enjoy reading, but I was absolutely swept away by it. It's an astonishing book in so many ways. It tells the story of the 3 expeditions to conquer Everest, 1921 to 24, and it tells the story of the 23 climbers, at the centre of which is this compelling and glamorous figure, Mallory, who dies on the third expedition, trying to reach the summit. And we still don't quite know, although Davis makes an argument, and I'll leave that for the reader to decide whether he's right, whether Mallory makes it to the summit or not. But his body wasn't found until 1999. So it was a mystery as to what happened to him. But he tells the story of these 3 expeditions and the 23 climbers who were involved. And all but 6 of the 23 had seen action as combatants or medics in the First World War. So it's also a book about the catastrophe of the First World War. And for those who had fought in it and survived, and then went on this quest to climb Everest, it becomes a kind of redemptive quest. This sense of noble sacrifice, this sense of heroic failure, as Fintan O'Toole calls it, this is kind of deep in the English psyche. And Davis not only tells the story, he interrogates these these myths, if we can call them myths. And the technical detail is fascinating. The prose throughout is fluent. And it's a book about empire. It's a book about the failures of empire. It's a book about masculinity. What's wrong with masculinity? What's wrong with these men? What's noble about these men? And I found it utterly compelling.
It is interesting what he does with the subject matter, Sarah, isn't it? That, you know, the goal, Jason talks about it being about empire. The goal of imperial exploration is seen as an outcome of and a response to the First World War.
Absolutely. And I like Jason, I am not somebody who would have picked up a book about mountain climbing in my spare time. And I'm not particularly sympathetic to the desire for conquest of natural objects. It's not how I view the world. So there were ways in which, for me, it was almost an antipathetic kind of a theme. And then I also was won over by that interest in history and his sense that this desire for conquest was absolutely shaped, if not quite directly catalyzed. They were all climbers before the war. They loved climbing. But the way in which empire and the traumatic aftermath of war combined to make this a kind of idée fixe, not just for Mallory and the other climbers, but for the nation. And there was this kind of noble redemptive project that everybody got behind. And along the way, Davis then humanizes this big story and these big claims by showing us in really moving detail the personal experiences of many of these men in war. He really brings to life the trauma. Many of them are suffering from what today we would call PTSD, and he gently suggests, without being heavy-handed about it, that this was a traumatic response for many of these men. But we also get the backstory of empire. We get the backstory of the exploration of the region and connecting it to British, the emphasis on discovery and not just on conquest. And then, because he is a 21st century writer, he also is sensitive to the interests and the perspectives of the people on the ground, particularly the people of Tibet and indeed the religion of Tibet, and how their understanding of the mountain is at a minimum in tension, let's say, with the understanding of these British men. And so he's shifting among all of these different perspectives, the backstories of these men at Cambridge. Many of them, Oxford and Cambridge, many of them were close friends before the war, then their stories through the war, and then as they come together to try to conquer Everest. And so for all of its big, sweeping, epic vista sort of aspects, it's also a deeply human story from start to finish.
And full of wonderful details, such as the third expedition. The supplies included 60 tins of quail and foie gras and 48 bottles of champagne, which is pretty extraordinary.
I mean, they're climbing Everest in +4s. And, it's just really amazing. They go up in a tweed jacket as if they're going for a stroll in Wales. And so the wonder isn't that any of them died. The wonder is that any of them lived to tell the tale.
Extraordinary stuff. So finally, the last book on your shortlist that you have chosen, Sarah, let's talk about James Shapiro's 1599. Again, we're kind of bookending this discussion about subjects that there has been so much written about William Shakespeare. What is it that Shapiro does that makes this one stand out and different?
So this was one of the books on our 24 that I have read before. In fact, I've read it before more than once. I was already a fan coming into this process. And then it was very interesting to weigh it up against the other 23, its co-winners, and to read it again for the first time in a while. For me, one of the great pleasures of it was that it held up so very well. And some of the books on rereading, I found that I was starting to see things that I liked less about them, that they maybe had dated a little bit, or what have you. But 1599 remains an extraordinary feat. The thing that I love about it is that it is in one sense, from first page to last, an educated guess, right? And yet what Shapiro does is show what you can do with an educated guess if your education is extraordinary, if your erudition is deep and profound, and then if your guesswork is subtle and intelligent and modest and human, So what he does is he takes, because there's on the one hand, as you say, Shakespeare is one of the most written about subjects in the world, in English certainly. And yet we know very, very little about Shakespeare's life and about his biography. But rather than, wondering what made Shakespeare leave Stratford or why he married Anne Hathaway, what Shapiro does is focus his attention on a singular pivotal year and tell us everything that is known about that year, and then think through the relationship of what is known about that year and deeply intelligent readings of the four major masterpieces that Shakespeare produced in that year: Julius Caesar, As You Like It, Henry V, and Hamlet, and think through their relationship to what's happening around Shakespeare, so that he shows us not a speculative life of Shakespeare, not what he had for dinner, if Shapiro doesn't know what he had for dinner, but what the political and cultural and religious life around him, the conflicts and the tensions and the changes, and the tensions and the pressures, how they might have informed those plays. And so he moves back and forth between the really incredibly interesting political dramas of Elizabethan England. This is the moment when Essex goes to Ireland, and against this backdrop of high political drama, Shapiro brings us into these really subtle, judicious readings of these very well-known and well-loved plays. And along the way, what he does is make you look at these four major plays in different ways. It culminates in a kind of, to me, triumphant reading of Hamlet, where you just suddenly see Hamlet in through a different lens. And it's an endlessly enjoyable kind of journey through Elizabethan England with, the most informed tour guide you're ever going to meet.
Jason, did you feel as you were reading it that it was revolutionary when it comes to Shakespeare studies?
Well, like Sarah, I read it when it was first published. And indeed, when I look back, I chose it as one of my books of the year in 2006, but I hadn't read it since. But at the time, of course, I reread it with great pleasure, and it does stand up to a second reading, indeed a third reading. What I loved about it at the time was its freshness. One of the problems with Shakespeare studies is you know so little about Shakespeare. So much of it is speculation and conjecture and endless supposition and the asking of questions. But what he does so brilliantly is locate Shakespeare in his time and in a particular period. 1599, unrest, wars, turbulence in Ireland, and the Earl of Essex goes to Ireland. Amazing figure, the Earl of Essex, and Shapiro writes about him so well and so engagingly. The end of the Elizabethan period, 1599, 1603, we had King James comes down from Scotland, James I of England, 6th of Scotland, and we have the beginnings of the Stuart era. So this is a really pivotal year when so much is coming to an end, and I was compelled by that. I'm compelled by the context in which we live, the political and historical context in which we live and work. So, I was compelled by that. But what I particularly liked about the book was its close reading of the plays, not least Hamlet. And there's two wonderful chapters on what Shakespeare does so boldly in Hamlet, and the way he uses the soliloquy, and how he's been influenced by his reading of Montaigne and of the essay, and how he brings the essay, the personal voice of the essay, and brings it into Hamlet and enables Hamlet to we see from the outside the inside, as it were. Hamlet speaks in words what's in his mind. And Shapiro is extremely good on that. And I know, Sarah, when you and I were talking about this, we were really fascinated by his reading of Hamlet and also his reading of the form of the essay. Do you think?
Absolutely. And as you say, I mean, for me, one of the great pleasures of the book is as I said, the way that it moves back and forth between, you can think of it as we can use the metaphor of the camera, right? It zooms into these beautiful, elegant, judicious, close readings of these great plays, and then it pans out again to show us what's happening all around Shakespeare and how that understanding informs what's happening on the page. And so it's just this beautifully judged melding of text and context, to use the academic words for it.
Yeah, and also the style, accessible, never seeks to knows a lot, but never demonstrates to the reader that he knows too much. So he's never condescending. Yeah. He's never superior in tone.
He wears his learning very lightly, but it is steeped in learning.
Absolutely, but it's not oppressive in any way, and he writes a good, clean, fluent English sentence, and it's a pleasure to read.
You have both been so wonderful in describing why these books have made it onto the shortlist. Thank you so much, Jason Cowley, Sarah Churchwell, for joining us today. I just want to ask you before you go, I mean, how daunted are you by the next stage of your reading? Sarah?
Jenny, I'm really looking forward to it because these are marvelous books that all bear rereading. And so I'm going to give myself the pleasure of rereading them and see which one I think, deserves the laurel. So it's at this point, it's a win-win in kind of every sense from my point of view. We've got wonderful books and one of them will make it to the top.
Jason?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it as well. I mean, it's been a great pleasure to chair the discussions because my fellow judges are such smart readers and they're so enthusiastic and they've done the work. They're diligent, they're dedicated, they speak with great authority and passion about the books, and it's a pleasure for me to be in the room and listen to that. So our final conversation, no doubt we may disagree, but I do hope ultimately we settle on a winner that satisfies us all.
Thank you both so much for being with us today. We'd also like to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its generous support of this podcast. Now, to find out more about the Baillie Gifford Prize, you can visit the website or follow us on Twitter at BG Prize. And if this episode has piqued your interest in the history of the prize, you can find a 30-minute documentary on the website. The Winner of Winners Award will be announced on the 27th of April at an event held at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. In the meantime, I'll be talking to each of the shortlisted authors about what's inspired them and what it's like to be in contention for the Winner of Winners Prize. Hope you'll join me again. Bye-bye.
Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.